Chloe, what in God's name are you doing out here? You're going to catch your death. Julian Vance's voice was a sharp crack of thunder that cut through the storm. He slammed the door of his Bentley, the sound swallowed by the sheets of rain sweeping in from Lake Michigan. All he could focus on was her, Chloe Miller, his maid, huddled beneath the dripping branches of an ancient oak tree on his front lawn. She sat on the soaked grass, a small plastic container resting on her lap, her pale blue uniform plastered to her thin frame. Her blonde hair was dark with rain and stuck to her face in limp strands. She looked utterly frozen, a fork held loosely in a trembling hand. "Chloe," he repeated, his voice harsher with disbelief as he strode into the downpour, his own expensive suit instantly darkening with water. "Why are you eating in a hurricane? Get inside the house." She flinched at the sound of his voice, a reaction so sudden and sharp it was like watching a startled deer. The lid of her lunchbox snapped shut with a faint click. Her lips parted, but the tempestuous wind and driving rain stole whatever words she tried to form. I'm sorry, sir," she finally managed to stammer, her gaze fixed on the muddy ground at his feet. "I didn't mean to." Before Julian could press her for an explanation, another voice emerged from behind him, smooth and practiced, sheltered from the storm's fury. "She has no business being out here at all, Mr. Vance," said Ms. Finch, the head housekeeper, stepping forward with perfect, unruffled poise beneath a large black umbrella. "I was on my way to inform you of her carelessness. She broke the Vance family heirloom this afternoon. The Lalique vase from your mother's collection." Julian spun around, the rain plastering his own hair to his forehead. "What?" Ms. Finch sighed, a delicate, theatrical sound of regret, her eyes cast downward. "I discovered it shattered in the grand hall. She was the only one assigned to that area. I attempted to discuss the matter with her, but she refused to confess." Chloe's head shot up, sheer panic widening her blue eyes. "No, sir, please, that isn't what happened." Julian's expression hardened into a mask of cold fury. That vase wasn't just crystal. It was a vessel of memory, a piece of his mother he could still touch. It had survived 3 generations, a silent testament to his family's journey from struggle to prominence. "You broke it?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "After every specific instruction you were given about that room?" "I didn't, sir," Chloe's voice fractured, thin and desperate. "I was polishing the credenza in the corridor when Ms. Finch!" "Enough!" his voice boomed, a raw command that momentarily silenced the storm itself. The veins on his neck stood out in sharp relief. "Do not stand there and lie to my face. There is nothing I despise more than dishonesty in my own home." The force of his outburst made her recoil, stumbling backward on the slick, wet grass. Her heel caught on an exposed root, and she went down hard, scraping her palm against the rough gravel of the garden path. Her lunchbox flew from her grasp, spilling a meager portion of rice and beans into the mud. A thin trickle of blood bloomed on her hand, mingling with the rainwater. But she didn't cry out. She simply stared up at him, her eyes glistening with a devastating mixture of shame and heartbreak. "I didn't do it," she whispered, her voice trembling but imbued with a strange, unwavering steadiness. "Please, you have to believe me." Julian stood over her, his chest heaving with a chaotic storm of anger and a disquieting flicker of confusion. Behind him, Miss Finch's expression remained a mask of serene composure, her tone as smooth as silk. "She has been increasingly negligent for weeks, sir. I warned her that she wasn't suited for tasks requiring a delicate touch." Chloe turned her desperate gaze to the housekeeper. "You know that's not true. You told me to dust the display cabinet. And then you—" She stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat as Ms. Finch's cold, dark eyes met hers. The older woman's lips curved into a nearly imperceptible smile, a silent, chilling warning that was completely hidden from Julian's view. Chloe swallowed the rest of her words, a visible tremor running through her. Julian raked a hand through his drenched hair, letting out a sharp, frustrated breath. "I don't want to hear another word about this tonight. Clean this mess up. We will address this in the morning." He turned on his heel, the anger and exhaustion churning inside him like the dark clouds overhead. Ms. Finch inclined her head in perfect obedience. "Of course, sir. I will ensure she tidies everything." Chloe pressed her bleeding hand against the thin fabric of her apron and whispered to his retreating back, "Yes, sir." Her voice was so quiet, it was barely a breath against the wind. An hour before the sky had torn open, the Gold Coast mansion had been an oasis of tranquility. In the grand hall, the priceless crystal vase had stood on its marble pedestal, catching the afternoon light. Chloe had been carefully dusting a nearby mahogany cabinet when Ms. Finch appeared, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You missed a spot," the housekeeper stated, her voice cool and clipped as she tapped a perfectly manicured finger against the wood. As Chloe turned to respond, she flinched when Ms. Finch's elbow deliberately brushed against the pedestal. The vase teetered for a heart-stopping second before tipping over, crashing onto the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. It shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments. Ms. Finch froze, her eyes wide with feigned shock for a brief moment before they narrowed with cold calculation. "Oh my," she murmured, her voice dripping with false concern. "Look what you've done. It wasn't me. You." "Quiet," Ms. Finch hissed, stepping closer until she was invading Chloe's personal space. Her voice dropped to a low, venomous whisper. "No one else was here. If you wish to continue working in this house, you will accept responsibility. If not, I will be forced to inform Mr. Vance that I caught you stealing from the pantry again. Do you understand me?" Tears welled in Chloe's eyes as she shook her head. "Please, I can't." "Then you can leave. Pack your bag and be gone before he returns. Go and sit outside until I determine the best way to handle this." The older woman's smile was almost gentle, which made it all the more terrifying. "And remember, my dear, silence is far more secure than unemployment." That was how Chloe Miller found herself sitting in the pouring rain, clutching her ruined lunch, as if it were her last possession on earth. Inside, Julian stood before the fireplace in his study, the flames casting dancing shadows on the leather-bound books that lined the walls. He had changed into dry clothes, but a profound chill clung to his skin, a dampness that had nothing to do with the rain. He poured himself a generous measure of bourbon, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass as he tried to drown out the memory of her trembling voice. Ms. Finch's account had been logical and convincing, yet something about it felt wrong, like a perfectly tailored suit that was a size too small. Chloe's eyes had held an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. It was fear, yes, but it wasn't the furtive fear of someone caught in a lie. He moved to the large window overlooking the gardens. Rain streaked down the glass, blurring the manicured landscape into a watercolor of greens and grays. She was still out there. He could just make out her small, hunched silhouette beneath the sprawling oak. Julian sighed, the sound a low rumble in his chest. "Damn it," he muttered to himself. Why wouldn't she just go inside? A soft knock on the study door made him start. "Come in." It was Mr. Silas, the estate's gardener, a man in his late 60s with a face weathered by years of Chicago sun and wind. He was soaked to the bone, his tweed cap dripping rainwater onto the priceless Persian rug. In his calloused hand, he held a small USB drive, carefully wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag. "Sir," Mr. Silas said, his voice quiet, as he glanced towards the window where Chloe sat. "I believe you ought to see this before you make any final decisions about Miss Miller." Julian frowned, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Mr. Silas hesitated, then took a step closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "It's security footage. I installed a small backup camera in the East Corridor, near the Grand Hall. Ms. Finch was unaware of it. I saw what truly happened." Julian stared at him, his mind struggling to process the words. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Silas extended the hand holding the USB drive. "The vase. She's been tormenting that poor girl for months, sir, making her work double shifts, berating her when you're not home. Today, she broke it herself. Then she blamed Chloe." "No." The word was a breath, a denial against a truth that was already beginning to settle in his gut. The study seemed to fall utterly silent, the only sound the crackle and pop of the fire. Julian slowly reached out and took the small drive, his fingers tightening around it. "You're certain of this?" he asked, his voice tight. Mr. Silas nodded, his expression grim. "Saw it with my own 2 eyes on the monitor before the storm knocked out the feed. She threatened to have me fired if I ever spoke a word of it. But I can't just stand by and watch her destroy that girl's life. Not after seeing her out there tonight." Julian's throat felt dry. He turned towards his mahogany desk, staring at the small piece of plastic and metal in his palm. It felt heavier than a bar of gold. "Thank you, Mr. Silas," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That will be all." When the gardener had departed, closing the door softly behind him, Julian sank into his leather chair. For a long, silent moment, he just watched the rain. Then, slowly, a cold and relentless guilt began to seep into him. He replayed the scene on the lawn in his mind. Chloe's terrified eyes, the blood on her hand, her spilled lunch sinking into the mud. He had screamed at her. He had believed the lie without a moment's hesitation. He ran a hand over his face, whispering to the empty room, "God, what have I done?" Outside, the ferocious downpour eased into a gentle, persistent drizzle. Beneath the oak tree, Chloe Miller still sat, completely unaware that the truth of her innocence now rested on a small silver drive on Julian Vance's desk. And for the first time in a very long time, the millionaire felt a clawing, unfamiliar sensation in his chest. Remorse. The storm had softened into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the window panes by the time Julian Vance leaned back in his leather chair. The USB drive lay beside his laptop, untouched. The fire in the hearth hissed and crackled, painting the walls of his study with flickering amber light. But Julian was oblivious to the warmth. His fingers drummed a restless rhythm against his chin, his thoughts circling the events of the evening like a predator. He should have plugged in the drive the moment Mr. Silas left. He should have sought immediate, irrefutable proof of the gardener's claims. But a part of him, a deep, intuitive part, already knew the old man had spoken the truth. The image of Chloe, curled beneath the oak tree like a wounded animal, was seared into his memory. The drenched uniform, the blood-streaked hand, and the quiet, heartbreaking acceptance of a fate she didn't deserve. And he had sided with Ms. Finch. He had accepted her version of events without question, without offering Chloe a shred of doubt's benefit. Julian closed his eyes, a wave of shame washing over him. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, a gentle but firm admonition from his childhood. Never judge a person by the words of someone who has never walked a mile in their shoes. Yet tonight, He had judged Chloe with the cold, detached precision of a corporate executive closing a deal, not as one human being to another. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his error, he reached for the USB drive. He inserted it into his laptop, and a single video file appeared on the screen. He clicked it open. The footage was slightly grainy, a consequence of the low light in the corridor. But the scene it depicted was agonizingly clear. The camera's wide-angle lens captured Ms. Finch walking briskly past the display case. She turned abruptly, her elbow jutting out to catch the edge of the marble pedestal. The priceless vase wobbled for a sickening moment before crashing to the floor, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. Julian leaned closer to the screen. Seconds later, Chloe entered the frame, her body language hesitant, her expression one of pure confusion. Ms. Finch's demeanor shifted instantly, her face contorting into a mask of cold accusation. She advanced on Chloe, stepping into her personal space and gesturing aggressively toward the shattered crystal. Although the footage was silent, her actions were unmistakable. She was blaming Chloe. Then, Ms. Finch grabbed Chloe's arm. Julian's jaw clenched so tight, a muscle jumped in his cheek. She was pulling her, leading her. No, she was pushing her toward the back entrance that led to the gardens. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 5:47 p.m. Julian glanced at the ornate clock on the mantel. It was now just past 7. Chloe had been outside in that storm for over an hour. He paused the video, the still image burning itself into his mind. A woman in a crisp, dark uniform standing over a younger woman in a pale maid's outfit, her finger pointed like a weapon. He felt something twist deep in his gut. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was rage. How long had this poison been festering under his own roof? He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Without a second thought, he grabbed an umbrella from the stand by the door and strode out of the study. The moment he stepped into the courtyard, the cool, damp air hit his face. His breath fogged in the crisp October air. The automated security lights along the flagstone path flickered to life as he approached the ancient oak. Chloe hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, her legs tucked to one side, her uniform soaked through. The blood on her palm had dried to a dark, rusty brown. The plastic lunchbox lay beside her, closed now, its contents clearly ruined. She didn't look up as he drew near. Only when his shadow fell over her, blocking the little light that filtered from the mansion, did she slowly, uncertainly, lift her eyes. He stopped a few feet away from her. "Chloe." She blinked, as if waking from a trance. Her voice was a fragile whisper. "Yes, sir?" "You're hurt," he said, his gaze falling to her injured hand. She glanced down at it dismissively. "It's nothing. I was wrong." She looked at him then, her gaze full and direct. Her eyes were weary, not just from the events of the day, but with a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of months, perhaps years, of being overlooked and undervalued. "I watched the footage," he said quietly. "The backup camera outside the grand hall. I saw everything." Chloe's breath hitched. "Then you know." He nodded, the simple gesture feeling wholly inadequate. The memory of Ms. Finch's calm, composed voice now seemed like venom echoing in his ears. Julian had trusted that voice. He had built his household on a foundation of structure and efficiency, allowing Ms. Finch to run it like a well-oiled machine. In doing so, he had allowed a rot to grow, unseen, in the very heart of his home. She broke it. She blamed you. She forced you out here. Chloe looked down, her fingers curling into a tight fist in her lap. "I tried to tell you." "I know." His voice softened. And I didn't listen. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the sound of raindrops dripping from the leaves above. The water was starting to soak his shoulders now, but he didn't care. "I'm not going to ask you why you didn't fight back harder," he said, "because I think I already understand." She lifted her head slightly, a question in her eyes. "You were afraid," he continued. "You've probably had to be afraid for a long time. Afraid of losing your job, afraid of not being believed, afraid of people like me not caring enough to look past the surface." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she didn't cry. She had likely exhausted all her tears long before he arrived. "I will not make that mistake again," Julian said, his voice firm with a newfound conviction. A cool breeze rustled through the trees. He took off his suit jacket and draped it over her trembling shoulders. She hesitated for a moment, then clutched it tightly around herself. It was absurdly large on her small frame, but it was warm. "Come inside. Let me take care of your hand," he said gently. "I don't want to cause any more trouble." "There is no more trouble to cause. Ms. Finch is finished here. Her employment is terminated, effective immediately." That seemed to catch her off guard. Her lips parted in surprise, but she remained silent. "I will make sure she never works in another private home in this city again," he vowed. "And you will never sit out in the rain again. Not ever." He extended his hand to her. For a moment, Chloe just looked at it, as if she wasn't sure it was real. Then, slowly, she placed her injured hand into his. He gently helped her to her feet. As they walked back toward the warm lights of the mansion, the rain began to fade, as if the storm had finally accomplished its purpose and was now ready to move on. Inside the sprawling, professional-grade kitchen, under the soft glow of pendant lights, Julian carefully cleaned Chloe's scraped palm with an antiseptic wipe. She sat silently on a tall stool, watching him with a quiet intensity. She was still wearing his oversized jacket. "You have a son, don't you?" he said suddenly, his focus on wrapping a clean white bandage around her hand. "Leo, is that right?" Her eyes widened in surprise. "How did you—" "Mr. Silas told me. He mentioned seeing some of his drawings in your apartment." She nodded, a soft, maternal light entering her eyes for the first time. "He wants to be an astronaut." Julian tied off the bandage and finally looked up at her. "Let's make sure he gets that chance." Chloe stared at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "Just promise me you'll never again believe that you deserve anything less than the truth." She lowered her head, and for the first time that day, her shoulders began to shake. It wasn't from the cold, but from the release of a burden she had carried for far too long. Julian stood by silently, giving her the space to let it all out. Outside, the last few drops of rain tapped a gentle rhythm against the kitchen windows. Tomorrow would be a different day. Julian Vance hadn't slept. The mansion had settled into its customary late-night stillness, a quiet symphony of distant hums from the climate control system and the rhythmic, stately ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the foyer. But none of the familiar sounds could soothe the disquiet in his soul. He had sent Chloe home in a car service 2 hours earlier, an offer she had politely declined at first. "I prefer the walk," she'd said, her voice still fragile. "It helps me think." He had watched her leave, still enveloped in his jacket, her posture remarkably straight, despite the ordeal she had endured. Now, Julian stood alone in his study once more, the USB drive still plugged into his laptop. He had replayed the video 5 more times since Chloe's departure. Each viewing was more painful than the last. How many months had this insidious cruelty been unfolding under his roof? How many mornings had she arrived, hoping for a day of simple, honest work, only to be met with Ms. Finch's quiet tyranny? How many small joys had she sacrificed to afford her son's medication? How many signs had he missed? Not because he was incapable of caring, but because he had simply failed to look. Julian poured himself a cup of black coffee, foregoing the sugar, and walked slowly toward the grand hallway. It was time to excise the poison. He pressed the button on the household intercom system. "Miss Finch, please come to my office." 5 minutes later, she entered, a picture of immaculate composure. Her posture was perfect, her dark wool dress severe and professional, her eyes calm and unblinking. "You wish to see me, Mr. Vance?" she asked, folding her hands before her like a pious statue. Julian gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." She complied without a word. "I have seen the security footage." She tilted her head just slightly, a masterful performance of confusion. "Footage, sir?" Julian tapped the spacebar on his laptop. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark room. Ms. Finch knocking over the priceless vase. Ms. Finch pointing an accusatory finger. Ms. Finch physically pushing Chloe out the back door as if she were a stray animal. He paused the video on a close-up of her face, her finger inches from Chloe's, her expression a mask of controlled rage. Ms. Finch's carefully constructed facade finally cracked, just a fraction. "Ah, that camera. I was not aware Mr. Silas had installed that one." Julian's voice was as cold as the Chicago wind whipping off the lake. "No, I imagine you weren't." She didn't flinch. "What would you like me to say, sir?" Julian leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "I would like you to tell me why." Miss Finch sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. And for the first time in her long tenure, she spoke not as a deferential housekeeper, but as the woman who had ruled this house from the shadows. "She doesn't belong here," she said, her tone even and hard. "She walks too softly. She carries herself like a victim. It unnerves the other staff." Julian stared at her, incredulous. "Because she's quiet?" "Because she plays quiet," Miss Finch corrected. "Do not be naive, Mr. Vance. Girls like her. They understand how to manipulate sympathy. The quiet demeanor, the sad eyes, the unwavering obedience. They use it to work their way into your good graces while you are not paying attention." His fingers clenched the arms of his chair. "She has a child, Miss Finch. She is working 2 jobs to keep a roof over his head. You bullied her, you threatened her, and you framed her for your own mistake. And when she didn't fight back, you interpreted that as weakness?" "She was never one of us," Ms. Finch replied, her voice as unyielding as marble. "I have kept this house running for 16 years. It has been clean, orderly, and proper. You never had to concern yourself with broken schedules, or food going missing from the pantries, or staff members falling behind on their duties, because I handled it. Now you intend to let it all fall into disarray because you wish to play the hero for the help." Julian stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow over her. "Get out." She blinked, the first sign of genuine surprise she had shown all night. "Excuse me?" "You are finished here. Collect your belongings. The driver will take you wherever you wish to go, but your time at the Vance estate is over." Her composure finally faltered. "You would throw away 16 years of loyal service for her?" "No," Julian said, his voice dangerously even. "I'm throwing you out because I allowed your brand of poison to infect my home for far too long." Ms. Finch stood, adjusting the lapels of her dress. You will regret this." "No," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "I regret not seeing you for what you truly are, much, much sooner." She left without another word. The next morning, the house felt different. It wasn't just quieter. Julian had expected that. It felt cleaner, in a way that had nothing to do with polish or bleach. Sophia, one of the younger maids, approached him outside the breakfast room, her expression hesitant. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For Chloe." Julian nodded, understanding that nothing more needed to be said. He called a full household staff meeting that afternoon. Standing beneath the magnificent crystal chandelier in the grand hall, he looked out at the faces of the people he had employed for years, but had barely known. "Chloe Miller is no longer a housemaid," he announced, his voice clear and resonant. "Effective immediately. She will be assisting me directly with internal affairs and household oversight. Her son's medical expenses will now be fully covered by the family trust. If anyone has an issue with this decision, my door is open." No one moved. Then, slowly, Sophia began to clap. A few others followed, until the hall was filled with a warm, genuine applause. Julian turned and walked away, unsure if the ache in his chest was from guilt, pride, or something else entirely new. Across town, in a small two-bedroom apartment tucked above a bustling laundromat in Logan Square, Chloe helped her son, Leo, with his science homework. He sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, a pencil clutched in his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. "How do you spell constellation again, Mom?" She smiled, her heart swelling. "Constellation. Remember? Like a big family of stars." Leo grinned, his missing front tooth making him look even younger than his 7 years. "One day, I'm going to be an astronaut. Then I'll buy you a real spaceship." She laughed softly. "Deal." Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from an unknown number, but she knew who it was from. It was Julian Vance. "Let's discuss your new schedule tomorrow. We have some changes to make, starting with a strict policy against eating lunch in the rain." Chloe stared at the screen, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of pain or fear, but of an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The quiet, profound warmth of being seen. Chloe returned to the Vance estate the next morning under a sky painted in the soft, golden hues of a Chicago autumn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp stillness that blanketed the manicured grounds in morning dew. Everything looked different, cleaner somehow, not in its physical appearance, but in its very atmosphere. As she stepped through the staff entrance, she felt a strange lightness under her feet, the absence of the ever-present tension that had once permeated the air. No one averted their gaze as she passed. No one whispered behind her back. Sophia, the young housemaid, offered her a warm smile and a gentle, "Good morning, Miss Miller," as she walked by. "Miss Miller?" Chloe gave a shy nod in return, adjusting the lapels of a borrowed blazer Julian had insisted she wear. Her uniform was folded neatly in her bag. Today, she was not here as a servant. Today, she was stepping into a new role, one that felt both terrifyingly foreign and long overdue. Julian was waiting for her in an office in the East Wing, a room that had formerly been used for accounting and storage. Now it had been cleared out and freshly arranged with a simple but elegant desk, a new laptop, and a comfortable chair facing a large window that overlooked the rose garden. "Morning," he greeted her without looking up from his phone. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," she replied softly. "You can call me Julian in here, if you're comfortable with that." She paused for a beat. "All right, Julian." He looked up then, and she was struck by how much more rested he seemed. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened. There's coffee brewing in the side room. I also had them stock some herbal tea. I thought you might prefer that. I do. Thank you. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment. Then he gestured toward the desk. That's yours. You'll be helping me with internal management, schedules, staff needs, rotation adjustments, anything that's been falling through the cracks. Chloe stepped closer, running her hand lightly over the smooth, cool surface of the desk. It was made of real oak, worn in places but beautiful. A tree repurposed, given a new life, much like herself. Julian watched her, then cleared his throat. I also spoke with the foundation this morning. We're establishing a medical trust for Leo. It will provide full coverage for his doctor visits, medications, and any future needs. Her head jerked toward him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You don't have to do that. I know, he said gently, but I want to. He's a good kid, and you're a good mother. A wave of emotion swelled in her throat, too sharp and powerful to swallow. Thank you. He offered a small, sincere smile. You've thanked me enough. Let's get to work. Mid-morning, Chloe walked through the mansion with a clipboard and a pen, relearning the vast estate through a new lens. It was no longer just a collection of rooms where she scrubbed floors and changed linens. Now, it was a complex network of people, systems, and hidden cracks that had been painted over for years. She passed through the laundry corridor, where two maids, Maria and another woman, were folding towels with practiced rhythm. Miss Miller, Maria said quietly, her voice warm. We're so glad you're still here. Chloe paused, a genuine smile touching her lips. Thank you, Maria. Miss Finch always said you were just temporary, the other maid added. That you wouldn't last, but you did. I'm not going anywhere, Chloe replied, her voice soft but firm. That afternoon, Julian called her into his main office. He was reviewing a spreadsheet detailing staff turnover rates, his brow furrowed in concentration. His tone was lighter now, tinged with a genuine curiosity. Did you know we've lost 6 housekeepers in the last 2 years? He asked, looking up at her. Chloe raised an eyebrow. I didn't know the exact number, but I'm not surprised. He leaned back in his chair. You think that was Ms. Finch's doing? I think she created an environment that people didn't want to survive in, Chloe replied honestly. Fear doesn't build loyalty. Julian steepled his fingers, studying her. And you? Why did you stay? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Because I didn't have the luxury of leaving. He nodded slowly. A fair answer. There was a soft knock at the door. Mr. Silas, the gardener, stepped in, holding his cap in his hands. Begging your pardon, sir. Miss Miller. He gave her a respectful nod. Julian motioned him in. You don't need to knock anymore, Silas. The old man smiled, his weathered face crinkling at the corners of his eyes. Old habits die hard. He looked at Chloe, his expression sincere. I just wanted to say thank you for staying strong and for making this place a little less cold. Chloe's eyes softened. You're the one who stood up when it mattered most. Mr. Silas shook his head. It took me too long. I was scared, too. Julian glanced between them, a look of understanding dawning on his face. I think a lot of us were, he said quietly, but not anymore. Later that evening, after the last of the staff had departed and the mansion's lights had dimmed to a gentle ambient glow, Chloe found herself wandering out into the garden. She walked past the perfectly trimmed hedges, down the familiar stone path, and stopped beneath the sprawling oak tree. The very same place she had sat just 2 nights ago, bleeding, silent, and invisible. Now, the air was still and quiet, the tree's leaves still damp from the recent storm. She looked up through its massive branches and exhaled slowly. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about victory. It was about being able to breathe freely again. Behind her, she heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel. "I had a feeling I'd find you here," Julian said. She turned slightly. "I just needed a minute." He nodded, coming to stand beside her. "You know, for the longest time I thought this place ran like a perfectly calibrated machine. Efficient, predictable." He paused, "But I never stopped to ask what was being ground up in the gears." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. He glanced up at the branches overhead. "I had no idea the strongest person in this entire house was sitting right under this tree." Chloe offered a faint smile. "I wasn't trying to be strong. I just didn't have another choice." Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a soft cloth. He unwrapped it gently to reveal a small ceramic bird, old and cracked at the base, but intricately painted. "My mother gave this to me when I was 10, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I dropped it once, broke its wing. I hid it from her for weeks, terrified that she'd be furious." "What happened?" Chloe asked. "She found it, of course, and she just said, 'Things break, Julian. That's how we know they're real.'" He looked at her, his gaze intense. "I think people are the same way." Chloe's breath caught in her throat. He handed her the small figurine. "Keep it, as a reminder that not everything that's broken has to stay that way." She took it carefully, her fingers brushing against his for a fleeting moment. "Thank you." They stood together in the quiet of the garden, the last rays of the setting sun fading behind the grand estate. And for the first time, Chloe didn't feel like the help. She felt like someone who belonged. The kitchen had always been a place of echoes for Chloe. The clang of pots and pans, the low murmur of staff gossip, the rush of running water over stainless steel. For most of her time at the Vance estate, she had moved through this space like a phantom, unnoticed, efficient, and utterly forgettable. Now, as she stepped into the staff kitchen, not as a servant, but as someone with a voice, the room seemed to pause. Maria and Sophia were at the large prep counter, slicing fresh fruit for the next morning's breakfast service. They looked up as she entered, just for a moment, but this time their gazes didn't slide away. "Miss Miller," Sophia said with a respectful nod, "there's fresh coffee brewing if you'd like some." "Thank you," Chloe replied with a soft smile, setting her tablet down on the counter. "Please, don't let me interrupt. I'm just doing a quick walkthrough." Dot. She moved past the towering pantry shelves, taking note of inventory tags, checking for expired labels, and cataloging missing equipment. It was a routine task, but one that had never been hers to perform before. Ms. Finch used to handle all kitchen audits herself, often delivering her findings with threats rather than constructive feedback. Chloe approached it differently. She leaned slightly toward Sophia. "Have you been having any issues with the produce deliveries lately? I noticed we were short on eggs again." Sophia shrugged, her knife pausing over a pineapple. "It happens once or twice a month. Ms. Finch used to say it was our fault, that someone was sneaking extras home." Chloe raised an eyebrow. "Was that true?" Maria shook her head, a wry smile on her face. "Not unless someone was trying to feed a family of 12 with a single carton." They all shared a brief, knowing laugh, the sound breaking the last of the lingering tension like a brittle shell. Chloe scribbled a note on her tablet. "I'll follow up with the supplier directly. And I'll make sure no one gets accused of anything again without concrete proof." Maria tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "It's strange, hearing that from someone who used to get blamed for everything first." Chloe's smile didn't fade. "It's strange saying it," she admitted. "But we're doing things differently now." From the hallway, Julian watched, unseen. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but as he passed the service wing, he had caught a glimpse of Chloe through the small glass window on the kitchen door. She was standing with her head tilted, actively listening to the staff, not barking orders or carrying herself with the arrogance of newfound power. She hadn't changed who she was at her core. She had simply, finally, arrived. He continued on his way, a sense of rightness settling over him. There were more changes to make. That afternoon, Chloe met Julian in the study, which they had converted into a joint operations room for managing household affairs. She carried 2 reports, one on food inventory and the other on long-overdue maintenance requests. He was reviewing the estate's financial reports on a second monitor. He looked up as she entered. "How's the kitchen?" "Lighter," she replied. "Less fear, more fruit." He chuckled. "We'll call that progress." She handed him the reports. "We also need to discuss the laundry schedule. Maria's been doing double shifts without a single complaint, but I've noticed she's starting to limp by the end of the day. She'll never say anything herself. She's too proud." Julian glanced over the pages, his expression serious. "Let's cut her hours by 20% and give her a raise. I'll absorb the budget adjustment from my personal accounts." Chloe blinked, surprised by his immediate and generous response. "That's very generous." "Generosity isn't charity, Chloe," Julian said, his eyes still on the report. "It's responsibility." She nodded slowly, committing the phrase to memory. Julian glanced up at her then. "You're good at this." "I'm just doing what should have been done all along." He watched her for a beat longer. That's the part most people overlook. The small, essential things that no one notices until they stop happening. In the late afternoon, the house fell into a quiet lull. Chloe found herself in the formal sitting room, a space she used to avoid whenever guests were present. She remembered once sitting in the corner with her lunch, while Ms. Finch's voice hissed just out of earshot. She should eat somewhere else. The smell of bleach clings to her. Now, she sat briefly on the edge of the plush velvet settee and looked out the large bay window. From this vantage point, she could see the old oak tree in the garden, standing proud and scarred against the autumn sky. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Sophia. "Just wanted to say thank you again. It feels like we can finally breathe in this place now." Chloe stared at the words for a long moment, then typed back a reply. "We all deserve air. No one should have to ask for it." She hit send and leaned back, letting the warm afternoon sunlight wash over her skin. That evening, to the surprise of the entire staff, Julian joined them for dinner at their table in the main kitchen. The remaining employees looked startled at first, but as the meal progressed, a simple but delicious meal of roasted chicken, steamed green beans, and cornbread, the conversation became natural and easy. Sophia told a funny story about a misdelivered package. Mr. Silas laughed so hard he spilled his water. Julian, still in his dress shirt, but with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, listened more than he spoke. Chloe glanced at him once, catching the small crease in his brow, the one that only appeared when he was genuinely trying to understand something rather than command it. After dinner, as the staff cleared the table, Julian turned to her. "I was thinking," he said, "about starting a monthly meeting with all the staff, not just for updates, but for real conversations." Chloe smiled. "Are you ready for that?" He gave a half smile in return. "I'm ready to hear what I should have been hearing years ago." Later, Julian walked Chloe to the staff entrance. The night was cool but calm, the sky above a dark canvas pricked with sharp, bright stars, washed clean by the days of rain. "Thank you, Chloe," he said quietly. For what? She asked. For not quitting when I gave you every reason to. She looked up at him, her eyes soft in the dim light. I didn't stay for you, Julian. I know. I stayed because people like Miss Finch don't get to decide where I belong. He nodded slowly, a lump forming in his throat. I'll see you tomorrow, she added, and with that, she stepped out into the night, her head held high, leaving Julian standing in the doorway, watching the woman who had once sat in silence under a tree, now walking confidently toward a future she was building on her own terms. The next morning arrived with a sharp, invigorating chill in the air, the kind that hinted winter was just around the corner. Julian stood at the window of his master bedroom, sipping his first coffee of the day. As he looked out at the sprawling garden, he noticed the leaves on the old oak tree had begun their transformation, a vibrant tapestry of burnt orange and fading green. Even the tree seemed to be changing. His thoughts, as they often did now, drifted to Chloe. She had arrived every morning for the past week at precisely 7 a.m., punctual, but never hurried. Dressed in simple professional attire, always with a small notebook in hand, she moved through the estate with a quiet authority that was both natural and profound. The staff had accepted her leadership more quickly than Julian could have ever anticipated. Respect, he was learning, wasn't something that could be demanded. It had been earned long before anyone had bothered to notice. But today, he had something different in mind. He left the window and made his way down the east wing, past the formal sitting rooms and the stoic family portraits, to a hallway that few people ever used. At the very end of it, a door stood closed, polished oak with a tarnished brass knob, untouched since his mother's death nearly a decade ago. Inside was a room that no one had entered in years. He unlocked it with a key he hadn't held in his hand since the funeral. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that sliced through the tall, grimy windows. A worn leather armchair sat beneath a faded oil painting of his grandmother. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with the books his mother had loved. Medical journals, poetry, and copious notes from her days as a nurse. On a small side table rested a framed photograph, his mother holding him as a small child, her face radiating a warmth and pride that felt like a distant memory. He stood there, motionless, his heart seeming to tick a little slower. This had been her sanctuary. Before the cancer, before the long, painful silences, this was where she had come to think and to heal. Julian hadn't had the heart to touch it, to disturb the sacred stillness. But now, for reasons he couldn't yet fully articulate, he knew it was time to open it again. Not as a memorial to what was lost, but as a gift to what was being found. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Chloe. "Meet me at the end of the East Hall. Bring your planner. I have an idea." Chloe walked the long, unfamiliar corridor with measured steps. The hallway felt different from the rest of the mansion, older, quieter, holding its breath. She paused when she reached the open door and saw Julian inside, sleeves rolled up, brushing a thick layer of dust from a row of books. "I've never been down this far," she said softly. "Most people haven't," he replied, turning to her. He gestured for her to come inside. "This was my mother's study. She was a nurse before she married my father. This is where she read, wrote, and organized her charity drives." Chloe looked around, taking in the gentle, organized clutter, the palpable sense of untouched love that lingered in the air. "It feels like her." Julian nodded. "I want it to live again. I want it to be something real, not just a shrine." She turned toward him, her expression curious. "What do you want it to become?" He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. A wellness center for the staff, a quiet space, a reading room, a resource center, somewhere people can come to just breathe. Chloe blinked, a slow smile spreading across her face. That's incredible. I thought maybe you could help me design it, he said. You have better instincts than I do about what people really need. I'd be honored. They stood together in the center of the room, two people in a place filled with history, about to create something entirely new. A legacy built not on wealth or titles, but on healing and humanity. Later that day, Chloe returned to her small office in the East Wing. The quiet buzz of the estate's daily life moved around her, the sound of footsteps, muffled voices, doors closing, and the faint clinking of silverware from the distant dining area. She stared at her computer screen, working through staff schedules and supply orders, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Julian and the room at the end of the hall. It felt as if the entire estate was taking its first deep, cleansing breath. Just before lunch, Sophia entered with a tray holding a cup of tea and 2 warm croissants. "You don't have to bring this to me," Chloe said, though she was touched by the gesture. "I know," Sophia replied with a grin, "but I like that you actually eat now." Chloe laughed. "Thanks." Sophia perched on the edge of the desk. "You know, a few months ago, none of us thought you'd last here. Not because you weren't a good worker, but because this house, it didn't let people like us stay." Chloe looked at her, understanding dawning in her eyes. Sophia shrugged. "Now, we're starting to believe that maybe we are allowed to stay. Maybe even to belong." Those words stayed with Chloe long after Sophia had left. That evening, Julian walked through the garden, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. The stars were dim but steady above the sprawling trees. He paused beneath the old oak, his now usual spot for contemplation. He heard the back door creak open, then the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Chloe joined him, still wearing her office sweater, holding a thin file folder in one hand. "I finished the preliminary outline," she said, "for the wellness room." Julian took the folder and flipped through it slowly. He recognized his mother's spirit in every one of Chloe's ideas: quiet lighting, warm, earthy tones, journals for writing, resources for financial literacy, and lists of local therapists who offered sliding-scale payments. He closed the folder. "This is more than I ever expected." "It's what I would have needed," Chloe said simply. "A year ago, 5 years ago." He nodded, a long silence stretching between them. "You know," he said, glancing at her, "when I first hired you, I didn't even remember your name from the interview." Chloe smirked faintly. "That's okay. You saw me eventually." "I did." He looked at her then, his gaze steady and sincere. "And now, I don't want to look away." Her smile faded, not out of discomfort, but out of a shared sense of gravity. The weight of sincerity, she was learning, was always heavier than flattery. She nodded once. "Then, don't." He took a small step closer, not touching her, not crowding her space, just near enough for her to feel the shift in the air between them. "I won't." They stood together under the ancient tree in a comfortable silence. There was no more rain, no more secrets, only the quiet, powerful truth, finally allowed to speak. The weekend brought guests to the estate. They were not the lavish, champagne-guzzling crowd Julian had once entertained, but quieter, more thoughtful visitors. Longtime colleagues, a couple from his university days, and Dr. Alastair Reed, a silver-haired philanthropist whose medical foundation had funded a new wing at Northwestern. The Vance estate buzzed with a renewed sense of polish. The dining room gleamed, the grounds were immaculate, and fresh floral arrangements adorned the hallways. But Chloe felt the old tension returning, a low, familiar thrum beneath the surface of the beauty. Sophia approached her early Saturday morning in the linen closet, clutching a folded napkin. "They're already asking questions," she whispered, her eyes wide. One of them asked if the new girl was the help, or the help's manager. Chloe folded her arms, a wry smile playing on her lips. "And what did you say?" Sophia grinned. "I said, 'She's the reason this house is still standing, ma'am.'" "You?" Chloe chuckled under her breath. "Remind me to give you a raise when I have that kind of power." Sophia tapped her on the shoulder. "You already do. You just don't see it yet." Julian met Chloe in the East Wing shortly before lunch. "They'll be staying until Monday," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Dr. Reed and his wife are in the master guest suite. The Clarks are in the north rooms. I want things to be comfortable, but not ostentatious." Chloe nodded. "I've reviewed their dietary notes and sleeping preferences. Everything is in place." Julian hesitated for a moment, then added, "One more thing. Ms. Finch used to keep a detailed guest log. I want you to start updating it again. Not just with names, but with observations, notes. We should be keeping better track of who we allow into this house." Chloe raised an eyebrow. "Surveillance?" "Context," he corrected. "We've trusted too many masks in this house. I'd rather not make that mistake again." She nodded. "Understood." Later that day, Chloe moved through the corridors with her notebook in hand, discreetly observing and listening. She didn't insert herself into conversations. She didn't need to. She already understood how power moved in a room, quietly, indirectly, and often hidden behind the most gracious of smiles. From behind a slightly ajar door, she heard the voice of Mrs. Reed speaking on the phone. "No, she's not staff anymore. Apparently, something happened here, some kind of internal scandal. Julian never said, but it's quite obvious. He's letting her roam around as if she owns the place." There was a pause. "I'm not saying she's dangerous, of course, but these people, when they're given power too quickly, it can change the entire balance of things." Chloe stood perfectly still, the notebook pressed against her chest like a shield. She knew better than to react, but her fingers tightened on the cover. That evening, after the guests had settled in and the dining room had been cleared, Julian invited Chloe to the study. He was seated on the leather sofa, reading a paper from Dr. Reed's foundation, but he looked up as she entered. "What's the temperature out there?" he asked. "Cool and measured," she replied. He tilted his head. "Meaning?" "Meaning Mrs. Reed thinks I'm the wrong kind of story." Julian's brow furrowed. "You heard her." It wasn't a question. He sighed, folding the paper and setting it aside. "I should have known." "It's all right," she said, her voice even. "People like her don't rattle me anymore." "They rattle me," he admitted, "because they never see the harm they cause. They hide it behind polished words and checks with too many zeros." He stood, walked over to the fireplace, and then turned to face her. "You don't need my protection," he said, "but I'm going to offer it anyway, not because you're vulnerable, but because they are dangerous." Chloe held his gaze, her own unwavering. "I don't need you to fight for me, Julian. Just don't let them rewrite the truth when I'm not in the room." He nodded slowly. "Deal." The next morning, Dr. Reed requested a personal tour of the house. Julian asked Chloe to lead it. "Are you sure?" she asked, surprised. "You know this place better than anyone. And frankly, I want them to see who's in charge now." She led the small group through the estate with a quiet, unshakable confidence. She answered every question with poise, describing the ongoing restoration efforts with a depth of knowledge that even Julian hadn't realized she possessed. When they reached the wellness room, his mother's former retreat, she paused at the doorway. "This used to be Mrs. Vance's private reading room," Chloe explained. Now, it's being converted into a wellness space for the staff, a quiet place for them to rest and recharge. Dr. Reed raised a skeptical eyebrow. Staff wellness? Julian stepped up beside her. A house is only as strong as the people who keep it standing. We've started treating them like human beings. Radical, I know. A tense silence hung in the air for a moment before Dr. Reed nodded once, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Progressive, he conceded, but long overdue. Chloe didn't smile. She didn't need to. The point had been made. That night, after the guests had retired to their rooms, Julian found Chloe in the garden, seated on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree. This time, she wasn't hiding. She was simply thinking. He joined her without a word. I used to be afraid of this tree, she said after a moment, her voice soft. It felt like the place you were sent when you weren't allowed inside. Julian looked up at the dark, sprawling branches. And now? Now, it's the place I come to remind myself how far I've come. He nodded. It's funny how a place doesn't have to change for its meaning to become entirely different. She glanced at him. The house hasn't changed. You have. I'm trying, he said. You're doing. They sat in a comfortable silence, the wind rustling the leaves softly above them. From inside, the mansion hummed with a quiet, peaceful life. But out here, in the cool, dark air, the real story was unfolding, wordless and still, built on a foundation of trust, resilience, and the profound power of staying. Monday morning arrived with a thick fog resting low across the grounds, like a breath held for too long. The estate was still waking, the staff moving in soft, deliberate steps, careful not to disturb the calm that had settled in after the weekend's polished chaos. The guests had departed just after sunrise, a departure Julian had ensured was swift and efficient. Chloe stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea in her hand, rereading a note left for her by Sophia. They're gone, left early, no hugs. She smiled. Sophia always had a way of turning disdain into poetry. She tucked the note into her pocket and returned to her office. The house was hers again, but the peace didn't linger for long. 2 hours into her workday, a courier arrived at the estate gates with a registered envelope. Security delivered it to Julian, who opened it in a heavy silence. He stared at the contents for a full minute before picking up the intercom. Chloe, my office. Now, please. She entered cautiously. Julian was standing near the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a folded piece of thick, official-looking paper. His jaw was tense, his gaze fixed on the fog-shrouded lawn outside. What is it? She asked. He turned and handed her the document without a word. She opened it slowly. It was a formal legal notice, an inquiry from the Reed Foundation regarding personnel reclassification at the Vance estate, and a stated concern about a potential conflict of interest in staff promotion practices. The language was sterile, wrapped in a veneer of professional politeness, but the subtext was venomous. Chloe looked up, her heart sinking. They're trying to discredit you, he nodded. And you. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. So, what do we do? We respond, he said, his voice firm. With truth, with facts, and with a firm reminder that I do not answer to anyone's comfort zone. She lowered the paper. They're not used to someone like me having a seat at the table. They'll get used to it. No, she said, a sad certainty in her voice. They won't. But we're not doing this to make them comfortable. Julian studied her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. He saw not fear, but a quiet, unyielding fire. I was thinking, he said slowly, of putting your name on the foundation documents, making it official. Co-chair. Chloe blinked, taken aback. That's not necessary. It is, he insisted, because I didn't rebuild this house alone, and the future of it should reflect that truth. She hesitated, her heart thudding against her ribs. You know what they'll say. They've already said it, he countered. You've earned this, and they can't erase that unless you let them. She looked down at the paper again, the weight of a name heavier than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about a title. It was about ownership, legacy, and standing not behind someone's success, but beside it. After a long, contemplative moment, she said quietly, Then, write it down. Chloe Miller, co-chair. The announcement was subtle. An internal memo, an update to the estate's leadership records, a new signature line added to the foundation's digital masthead. But word traveled faster than facts. By Tuesday morning, the calls began to pour in. Julian ignored most of them. He answered only one, from his lawyer, who told him, It's not illegal, Julian. It's just provocative. Good, Julian replied. Maybe it's time they were provoked. Chloe kept her head down and her work steady, but the ripples came regardless. An anonymous email arrived at the estate. You're turning the Vance legacy into a joke. A printed letter, unsigned, appeared in the mail. Some traditions are meant to be preserved. Not everyone belongs in the front office. Chloe read each one once, then filed them away in a folder she labeled Unsent Invitations. Sophia, on the other hand, had her own way of processing the backlash. She posted a handwritten sign in the staff kitchen. If you don't like the way things are changing, there's a door, and it ain't locked. By the end of the week, Julian and Chloe sat together in the garden beneath the old oak tree. He handed her a folder. No legal threats this time, just numbers. I want you to review this, he said. It's a series of scholarship proposals for a new fund under the Vance name. For single parents, working-class students. No legacy donors, no gatekeeping. Chloe flipped through the pages, her eyes widening. This is bold. It's overdue? She looked up at him. You're not afraid anymore. I am, he admitted honestly, but I'm tired of letting fear build my ceiling. She closed the folder, placing it gently in her lap. You know, she said, her voice thoughtful, I used to dream about escaping this place. Now, I dream about what it could become. Julian smiled. Then let's make sure it becomes that. That night, she walked past the grand guest room where she once wouldn't have been allowed to linger. She opened the door, just for a moment. The room was empty now, but the air no longer felt hostile. She whispered into the silence, I'm still here. And for the first time, the room seemed to whisper back, I know. The gallery hallway of the Vance estate was a silent corridor of legacy. Generations of portraits lined the walls, oil paintings in heavy, ornate frames, each face staring forward with a quiet, unwavering command. Julian had passed them daily without a second thought, their gazes becoming no more noticeable than the wallpaper. But now, as he and Chloe walked side by side through the hall, the silence felt expectant. These, Chloe said softly, nodding toward the long line of portraits, are all Vance's? He nodded. Everyone. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my uncles. My mother's photograph used to hang here too, but it's in storage now. It was too modern, according to Ms. Finch. Of course, Chloe murmured. Julian stopped near the center of the hall. You know what they all have in common? She tilted her head. Power. Silence, he said, his voice resonating in the quiet space. No journals, no letters, no diaries, just faces. No voices. She turned to him. You're changing that now. Julian looked down the long hallway. I want this house to speak again. Loudly. Honestly. Chloe stepped toward the far wall, which was blank except for a small, polished brass plaque that read, Reserved. She traced the edge of the plaque with her finger. What's this for? He glanced at it. It used to be for the next Vance heir. Since I don't have children, it's just been waiting. Chloe raised an eyebrow. What if it didn't have to be about blood? Julian gave her a long, thoughtful look. Go on. You're building something new here. A new kind of family, in a way. What if this wall told those stories? Not just who you were born to, but who helped you rebuild. He nodded slowly. You want to put your picture on the wall? No, she said with a small, knowing smile. I want to put their pictures on the wall. Sophia, Mr. Silas, Maria. The real heartbeat of this house. Julian exhaled through his nose, a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. That might upset a few board members. Good, Chloe replied simply. Later that afternoon, Julian sat in his study with Mr. Silas, sipping coffee. You've been here 21 years, Silas. You've seen everything. The older man leaned back in the chair, his weathered hands resting on his knees. Seen too much, sir. Some things I'm not proud of keeping quiet about. Julian nodded. Did you ever think about leaving? Mr. Silas shrugged. Plenty of times, but there was always someone worth staying for. At first, it was your mother. Then, it was the garden. Now, it's Chloe. Julian stared into his cup. I should have noticed sooner, he said, his voice thick with regret. We all should have, Mr. Silas replied gently. But noticing late is better than never noticing at all. Julian looked up. She wants to create a wall of honor for the staff. Mr. Silas blinked, his eyes widening. For us? She thinks the house should remember who really carried it all these years. The old gardener's eyes shimmered slightly. Then he chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. Well, damn. I never thought my face would end up framed in a place like this. Julian raised his cup in a toast. It's about time. Chloe, meanwhile, had begun interviewing the staff, one by one. These were not performance reviews. They were story-gathering sessions. She sat with Maria in the bustling laundry room. How long have you worked here? Chloe asked. 14 years, Maria said, her hands never ceasing their rhythmic folding. I started right after my husband passed away. This job kept me fed. It gave me something to hold on to when everything else was falling apart. Chloe scribbled notes in her planner. What do you want people to remember about you? Maria chuckled. That I folded the cleanest bed sheets east of the Mississippi. Her expression softened. And that I tried to be kind, even when it was hard. Chloe nodded. That's going on the wall. The new portrait wall came together in pieces. Julian cleared the space, had the simple, elegant frames ordered, and let Chloe choose the first 5 names. They started with Mr. Silas, Sophia, Maria, Rosa, the cook, and old Mr. Leonard, the estate driver who had retired 3 years earlier, but still visited on Sundays to play chess with Mr. Silas. Each photograph would be simple, black and white. No makeup, no forced poses. Just honest faces, with a single quote underneath, words they chose themselves. Sophia's read, I stayed to make noise, not to be quiet. Mr. Silas's read, every seed I planted here grew something bigger than I expected. Chloe's portrait wasn't up yet. She wasn't ready. That night, Julian found her alone in the archive room, sorting through old photographs from cardboard boxes that Ms. Finch had kept locked away. I found your mother's portrait, she said, holding up a photograph in